it's about an hour, but I'll stop about halfway through, and then we'll have some questions, and then I'll continue, and then we'll have time for some more questions. That's the theory. You know how I love to talk, so we'll see what actually happens. Frank, may I ask you to mute yourself, please? I should be able to mute everybody, but I'm not. Okay, I don't see, but yeah, if people could please just mute themselves, I'd appreciate it.
I can't find it.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, good. All right, so here we go, and let's just have fun, Yeah, there's a lot of information. I'm going to move quickly, but I will stop, and there'll be a chance to have some discussion. Okay, so how can we start any kind of discussion without going to Frederick Douglass? And this is a quote from a lecture that he gave to a women's anti-slavery society in 1852. And it's actually quite long, and he does a very good analysis. And I remember in the 60s, people began to read this as an anti-4th of July activity, and people would take turns reading the whole paper and discussing what it meant at that particular time. So yes, what is the 4th of July? The day that reveals more than any other the gross injustice and cruelty. And then he ends by saying, there is not a nation on the earth guilty of practices more shocking and bloody than are the people of these United States at this very hour. And this was 1852, but it actually got quite worse. The practices and they became even more guilty and shocking. So the Civil War, it was only 4 years. 4 years out of the entire history. It was the United States against the 11 Confederate states, but there were also the role of the 4 to 6 border states. And so we'll look just very briefly at why. Juneteenth refers specifically to June 19th, 1865, when General Granger read a proclamation in Galveston, Texas. And I'll come back to that a little bit more in detail. So 4 years, the federal government against the Confederate states, the 11 southern states, with vacillating roles played by the border states. Pre-Civil War, one of the clauses that were at issue was the fact that according to the Constitution, and this was for purposes of representation, counting heads in terms of who could vote. And this is where the term was included that the people who could vote would be determined by their whole number of free persons, which really meant white men, and then including those bound for service for a term of years, again, those white men bound for a term of years, and excluding Indians not taxed. So if Indians actually paid tax, so they would be counted as white men, and then 3/5 of all other persons, but it was 3/5 of all other African men, because women were never included in any of this discussion. So this is where this 3/5 comes from, and it was purely for purposes of representation, but again related to taxation. Overall, the conflict was based on the needs of an agrarian society versus a growing industrial economy, which was really preparing for a more significant role as an imperialist nation. And so, a lot of issues in terms of the resources of the country as a whole, and then the role of labor. Labor is very important. Whenever you're talking about the labor, you have to talk about what do people do? What are the skills that they have? And so there was a lot of discussion in terms of the needs of the South for basically unschooled labor versus the needs of the North, which would require more semi-skilled and skilled labor. And so those were some of the precipitating, just very briefly, causes in terms of politics and economics. In terms of African Americans, certainly we know that there had been a continuing influx. There was the abolition of the recruitment of slavery, but there continued to be what was called the farm slavery. There continued to be particular states, areas, and plantations that were breeding sites. And so even though there could no longer be the importation of Africans, the retention of people in servitude continued. There was, of course, that the opposition to that, the abolitionist movement, but even within the abolitionist movement, there were a number of competing concerns. It wasn't if the abolition movement as a whole said that all Africans should be free. Not at all. In fact, there was a large percentage that really wanted people to be equipped financially and sent back to Africa. And that's where we get Liberia from, and Monrovia. Monrovia was named after James Monroe. And so basically we had this transition from enslaved Africans becoming African Americans, now being sent back to Africa to become an elite class over indigenous Africans, particularly in Liberia. You also had people who wanted to settle people in the unclaimed lands of the United States, which basically meant the West. And so there was a conflict there with indigenous Americans and the state of Mexico. We'll come back to that briefly. So all this culminated in the Emancipation Proclamation, which was really two documents. It was September 22nd, 1863, which said, 62, which said, prepare for the actual date on January 1st. And so, and even there was a qualification. So was the enslavement the root of the whole Civil War? It really was the economy. Which way was the economy going? And to the extent that skilled labor was needed, what would be the nature of that labor? And what I like to do, as some of you know from prior discussions, is I use a lot of political cartoons because I like to show how these issues were presented at the time by social commentators of that era. So here, the South is represented as backward, unlettered, the woodsman, that kind of thing. And the North is represented as this elite industrialist. And that really wasn't true. The South had a large percentage of lettered planting within the planters class, and they were capable of holding their own with anyone from the North. So let me just stop there because I was going to, okay. At the same time, some saw the Emancipation Proclamation as a panacea. It was going to be a cure-all. And somehow once this statement was made, the society as a whole would change and would change in the benefit to benefit African Americans. But that's not what happened at all. This is a picture of Jefferson Davis, his wife, his daughter, his 3 granddaughters, and his maid. And so there were definitely entrenched interests who wanted to keep the status quo exactly as it was, as represented by this photo. That included, of course, keeping people entrenched as in the picture in terms of the cotton, and that was very often was done with some of the most barbarous acts against the enslaved Africans. And so again, thinking back to Frederick Douglass, when he talks about the brutality and the horrors of this period, there were the acts of brutality were extreme throughout the country in order to subdue. And so when you have acts like this, then we know there was resistance. You don't, inflict this kind of barbarism unless people were trying to be free by any means necessary. So part of changing this narrative is really understanding and accepting and promoting that, yes, there was resistance throughout. Otherwise, there wouldn't have been these extreme measures put into place to keep people bounded. People saw their way out of slavery through education, even though that was often, again, a threat of some kind of imprisonment or punishment. The group of men that you see here represent brothers who went to the West to settle the West. And again, that's a part of the narrative that isn't discussed. They went as cowboys, and actually the term cowboy came from African-American men who were responsible for the large herd of cattle that were taken from farms to the railheads to be shipped to the industrial centers. But there were also large number of African-American men who went to the West and settled in the West on their own or with their families. And so that part of the discussion, again, fails to be included. Certainly there were people who, like this couple, Samuel Harper and his wife, who went to Canada. And there are a number who went both individually, and we have all the stories we've heard, certainly living in Ohio. You know, we know that Ohio served as a route for the Underground Railroad, but there were 4 or 5 major migrations, if you will, or mechanisms by which Africans got to Canada and represent a part of the population even today. So the Emancipation Proclamation, so this is the glorified version that was signed by Abraham Lincoln, but it basically said that this was issued September 22nd, 1862, as a way to alert people that in January of 1963, all people held as slaves should be thenceforth and forever free. But the important part here that I want you to remember as we discuss Texas later on, it also said that the executive government of the United States, including the military and naval authority, will recognize and maintain the freedom and will do no act or acts to repress such persons, the freedmen. All right, so the government not only said it politically, but they said we're going to enforce it through the use of the military. And so on January 1st, the legal status changed of more than 3.5 million people, most of them in the Confederate States. There was another 500,000 that were in the North and the border states for various reasons. However, and this becomes important as we look at the discussion around Texas, it was understood, if not part of the legislation. It wasn't part of the proclamation, but it was part of the military orders, because you remember we're still in the time of the war. And so really the federal government is acting on a war status. And so as soon as a person could escape the Confederacy, and reach the Union lines or the Union troops, the person was permanently free. All right. And so that's where this whole, perhaps, some of the images of, people following the camps because, they knew they were safe with the soldiers, they knew they were free with the soldiers, and they were provided food, sustenance, and to some extent, employment. All right. And so this again becomes, we'll look at the differences with Texas. Now, I said this was part of the military, this is during a time of war, but was it something that was only happening somehow behind closed doors? And of course, the answer is no. The enslavement of people within the United States was something that was common knowledge to all citizens of the United States. And there were various laws, rules, mechanisms of enforcement from the municipal to the federal level so that everyone at some time or another came into contact with it. Now, the most obvious and the most odious, of course, was the actual sale of human beings. And so these are examples from the mid-1800s. of both the sale of a group of people and then a reward for someone who has run away. This is another example of a sale, and now this sale, the other was Virginia, but this sale is taking place in St. Louis, and Missouri was a border state. You know, several times I've said the border states, you know, were different in terms of, they fluctuated, they went back and forth in terms of what they did. Well, this is an example of where the state of Missouri, the city of St. Louis, allowed the sale of people, you know, within the city limits of St. Louis. And then the last one for Charleston, South Carolina, was actually for someone seeking to buy people. All right, and so so these are all public displays. They were in the newspapers. They were posted as handbills on the wall. It was common knowledge what was happening. At the same time, there was the abolitionist movement, and it too was common knowledge. So the Anti-Slavery Fair, for instance, here was hosted by the Ladies Society, and it was to raise funds, you know, to publish material, to send people to the South, both as teachers and as as part of the Underground Railroad. It was to raise funds to provide assistance for people who were on the Underground Railroad or who acted as stations on the railroad. So that is the one, and then the other is just a handbill that was posted by such a society. The soldiers themselves were a major, major issue. And some of you may remember Glory, if you saw the film Glory. And there was some concern as to whether or not African-American men would be true or capable of being soldiers. And so in the beginning, they were really only allowed the most menial tasks and weren't allowed access to firearms and were considered proper troops. But as various ones of them, you know, again and again proved themselves, they were allowed to be appropriate troops and allowed appropriate supplies, up to a point, because they were still segregated. They were not integrated with all the troops. They were segregated units, and they were given the oldest equipment, the least reliable equipment, but they were given equipment. They were allowed to actually fight. And that was a significant difference from the beginning. There was also a concern that men who were fighting on the Union forces and men who were fighting on the Confederate forces would actually abandon those identities for identities of ethnicity. And so there was some concern that these troops would actually join together and become an internal third force. And therefore, again, this was an unreliable group. But this, again, did not happen. It was perceived to be a threat, but it really never happened, because the Africans who were on the Confederate forces and were really entrenched within the Confederate stayed. And those who were with the Confederate, but only for expediency or to be able to get access to the Union forces, abandoned the Confederate forces and joined the Union forces. There's no example of Union and Confederate, enslaved Africans coming together and becoming this third force. But there was still a concern about the cheekiness of the formerly enslaved. And so there was a perception that with freedom, you would not be able to control these people, which of course, reliably so. And so, it's really this one monkey uncommon up, Massa. So it's still saying, okay, they're still recognizing that we really don't see you as a full human being, but we realize that we now have to share this space with you. At the same time, you have Lincoln saying, or the image of Lincoln saying, now that I've freed you, what are you going to do for us? Are you really going to, fight on our behalf? and do what needs to be done because of all that we've done for you. So there were different issues in terms of the perceptions in terms of the reliability of the Africans within the armed forces. And the other thing I just want to share with you briefly is the foreign perception, because remember, the slavery had been abolished, but the countries, the European countries, were still engaging in some limited, again, not only breeding of humans, but also in terms of their colonies, they were following policies and procedure that were the same as enslavement. And so there was some concern, in the mid 1800s, if the United States, gives freedom to these enslaved Africans, then what will happen to our people? How will this influence our people? And there was a group among the abolitionists and among the formerly enslaved who looked to various European countries for assistance, but they didn't get it. And so there was also just some concern that these formerly enslaved would be a bad example for the colonies that Europe still had and continued to have for some time thereafter. But there was also a sense that Europe would recognize that this internecine battle within the United States was becoming, within even the 4 short years, so serious that it might really be disruptive to the global economy. And so this cartoon is saying, at what point should we actually intercede, because perhaps our long-term interests are also being jeopardized. And this is a brief note, letter from a Democrat. And remember now, the Republican Party was the party of liberation. The Republican Party was the party of Lincoln. And so this is a letter from a Democrat, but one based in Illinois, who's talking about the changes that he is beginning to see during this transition period. And at the end, I thought it was instructive when he says, if the Negroes are only as brave as they talk, slavery will soon be wiped out. And then perhaps we may be able to teach the white rebels some sense, close up the war, and go home. If the Negroes are only as brave as they talk, as if it really was dependent on us to be able to turn the tide for the war. I mentioned that it was first proclaimed in September 22nd, and on December 31st, 1862, many people gathered in homes, in churches, in open fields, even in front of the master's house, because people didn't know what would happen. And many of you may belong to churches today where there is watch night. This began, what you're observing to this now began in 1862. Because the community as a whole said, we will be free, but what will that mean? Will my master believe that I'm free? How will I survive? How will my world change? And so people had talked about it and talked about it, but that night, they literally gathered throughout the South, wherever they were, to pray, sing, and just wait and see what would happen. I thought this was instructive with Lincoln when he says at the end, I claim not to have controlled events, but confess plainly that events have controlled me. So when people, you know, various, there are Lincoln scholars who have, you know, a lot to say about how it happened, but at the end of the day, there really was no confirmed strategy. There really was no confirmed vision. And he did what he could based on his moral code, but he was still severely impacted by the politics of the day. So 1863, it was Watch Night is over. It's January 1st, 1863. What happened? Now we've got 4 million enslaved Africans, Americans, now Americans who are now free. And because there was no path, there was no understanding of how to do this. It had not been done before. And remember, the country was on a war footing. The only money in the government was with that which was allocated for the military. So the Freedmen's Inquiry Commission was established in the War Department as a way to explore what would happen with these 4 million people. The familiar 40 acres and a mule really came from the Special Field Order number 15, and it was very instructive in that General Sherman actually met with a group of faith leaders, and he said, well, just tell me, what do you want? What do you need? What can we do? What should it look like? And the answer was, we are capable of fending for ourselves if we only had land. So at that point on the Sea Islands, there was a parcel of 400,000 acres. And that was the land that was split up into 40-acre plots. And that was shared to the people upon application in January of 1865. And because that seemed to work well, other people began to follow that, and if there was land available, began to issue the 40 acres. This was absolutely consistent with the distribution of land in the United States up to then. If we look at the Homestead Act, other examples, this is consistent. So there was nothing unusual. It was just the fact that this is now free, unencumbered land tenure being given to the formerly enslaved. And it wasn't until later in 1865 that the actual Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands was established. And although it was seen, again, the narrative was it was to help former Black slaves, but look after the and poor whites. And what happened, and again, there's the number of textbook studies done on this, on the Reconstruction era. But what happened was that rather than the African Americans being the beneficiaries, it was the poor whites. And it was the refugees were the poor whites, not the African Americans. And the abandoned lands were given to the refugees, the poor whites, rather than the African Americans. So again, the mechanism that was seen as a primary mechanism to actually ensure the success of the freedmen was undermined by the administrators, who included the poor whites. Now, in this period, from 1863 to 65, and I'll discuss why in a moment, by 1865, there were 250,000 out of this 4 million in Texas alone. And this did not occur. There were a significant number before the Civil War, and I'll show you, but this really represents a major movement of people in this 2-year period. So a number of people in the South who now saw they had lost the war began to move all their resources to Texas. And that's where the bulk of this 250,000 comes from. Right. The spring of 1865 was incredibly significant for the United States as a whole, and particularly for African Americans. Yes, the beginning of April, there was a surrender of Robert E. Lee. But then Lincoln was assassinated mid-April. His vice president should have been, but the person who was to have done that lost his nerve and turned in his arms. Then there was the surrender of the army in Tennessee, and then by the beginning of May, all the remaining forces had surrendered. The end of the war was declared at the beginning of May, so we've had 1 month from the surrender of Lee to the actual ending, announcement of the ending of the war by the federal government, and then the capture of Jefferson Davis, the man I showed you in the picture earlier. So 1 month, all of this happens. The remaining forces of the Confederacy that were outside Texas surrendered June 2nd. So now everybody is signed on. There's Kentucky and Delaware, but just leave them out of it. And then the battleship, the Shenandoah, in November. But up to now in June, the bulk of the land forces have all surrendered by June of 1865. So what is it that makes Texas different? I'm going to stop here and see if there are questions or comments. And you can either put things in the chat or you can unmute and ask. Am I talking too fast? No one has, there's no questions, no comments.
Oh, you're not talking too fast. I was surprised to learn a little bit more about cowboys and settlements and settlers. I just don't ever hear, I never hear talk about Black settlers. And I think that there were a lot of settlements in Ohio. Is that correct? Absolutely.
Ohio was part of the Northwest Territory, and it was considered, part of the West originally. And it was to have been a non-slave state, but assistance was given to slave-holding interests. Let me put it that way.
So with those settlements that were found in Ohio, were they predominantly all over, or was this something where there were particular states that were more common for Black settlements to be? Was it more like New York or farther, like northern parts or farther away, or they just sort of occurred in all sorts of places outside of slaveholding states?
They're all over. Some of them were very often just across the river. Whatever the dividing line was between enslavement and freedom, some of them were just the other side of the river or the railroad track or that highway, whatever that division was, the border. Some were just, as long as I can get across, I'll be free, I'm okay. So some settled there. Others followed industry as existed or was developing throughout the country. And so it really depended on the area of the country, the particular people who were involved, and the settlement possibilities.
In reading some slave narratives, it seems like sometimes that, I guess, the proximity was because of family members still being enslaved and they were trying to stay close. But was there also a significant risk of them being caught and brought back?
Oh, absolutely. That was a major
it seems
issue.
So risky to be just on the other, like way too close. But I suppose if your family was there, you just couldn't bear to leave them.
Yes, there was that, but there were also economic reasons. People just didn't have the resources to go further. And it was like, well, let me just stay here for a couple of years and, get myself together, then I'll move on. And they never moved on. So there were a number of social factors that kept people, where they were. Then other people kept going until they could get the furthest they possibly could. And so, or be without going to another country. So that was, you know, true in this area as well. So it really just depended.
Thank you for answering.
Julialynne,
Yes.
I wonder what happened to the abolitionist movement with the Emancipation Proclamation. At some point they lost their cause, but they could have blended into all the other issues that were going on at that point.
They primarily turned to education. They funded schools, they funded teachers and resources. They built schools and they really funded teachers. So some of the HBCUs started this way. That really, that's where a lot of that energy went. They said, okay, now that people are free, we want to make sure that they have the capacity to succeed in society. And so what's the most basic need is education. Yeah. So yes, so there were some other issues in terms of, you know, providing, again, some economic assistance or hiring people, that kind of thing. But really, the bulk of the time was education. Cheryl?
Yeah, but during, when the Emancipation Proclamation was issued, abolitionists weren't, you know, they just didn't go away because slavery still existed, especially in the border states and slavery in the North. So there was still a big push to try to eradicate slavery in non-combative areas.
Right.
As well as, you know, the push for education and, you know, so many movements, so many moving parts. What do we do with them once they're free? Do we send them back to Africa? Do we allocate land masses that are just Black lands, or, you know, there was so much stuff going on. All abolitionists were not slave friendly. They were against slavery, but that didn't mean they were necessarily eager for the slaves to be their next door neighbors, so to speak.
Exactly.
So
Exactly.
there was a lot of back and forth and pro and conning going on during that time period.
Right.
Is this where Kentucky kind of fits in, because they were in the Union and they were not part of the Emancipation Proclamation, and so therefore people there were still enslaved? Is that where that also fits into this?
Exactly. That's why I waffled earlier, because Kentucky, they didn't go until the 13th Amendment in December of 1865. They held out. Okay, go ahead, Cheryl.
And also that was why there was a split between Virginia and West Virginia, because West Virginia broke off to remain free.
Right.
A lot of slaves kind of just slid on over the border into West Virginia, because that became a slave state at the start of the war. So that border situation was very, very dicey.
Right. And there's a very interesting text on Black Appalachia, because a number of people went into the mountains and they established their own communities in the hollers, you know, the hills and valleys of West Virginia, Tennessee, and that whole area. And they just didn't come out. And so people don't even think about that. When they think about Appalachia, you really think about the Scots-Irish and the folks coming over. But there was actually an extensive African population. Let's get Shelley in for a minute, and then I'll go back to the presentation. Shelley?
Yeah, hi Julialynne. I'm sorry, my video isn't working.
Okay.
But I was really intrigued by a comment you made early in the presentation about sort of proving that slavery was widely known in the population, which kind of suggested that there's an historical narrative that suggests that it sort of makes people think that it was kind of underground. And I guess I always thought that it just never occurred to me that people would think that not everybody knew about it. Can you say any more about, you know, that? Is there like a narrative, a sort of a narrative being told about it being not an open thing?
Well, you're gonna take me to the end of the presentation in a sense, but you just think about today, and you think about the things that people should know. Well, okay, let me do it another way. Very often, as I've moved around in different countries, and particularly within South Africa, and I've met people who said, well, I didn't know. And I'm like, but why didn't you know? And why didn't you ask why when you saw certain situations? So how could you not know if you would just ask why? You see something and just, why is this happening like this? So many people who lived in the North would say, well, we're not slaveholders and that's happening down in the South. But as has been discussed already, you know, it was possible. New York, a number of the states made laws allowing people to come across state lines, recapture people, and take them down south. And you saw this. You saw the ads. You saw the. So you couldn't say, well, why is this happening? You know, how could you not say, why is this happening? And then follow the connect the dots. So I don't know. You know, you read some of the work, and you do hear people say, I didn't know, I didn't understand, I thought it was only, they said it was like indentured servitude. We hear this discussion today, and that's just not what the information says. That's not what is provided. Okay, so but I'm going to come back to this a little bit at the end as well.
Great, thank you so much. I'd never really thought about the willful ignorance aspect of of that time period. Thank you.
It's easier. I mean, I mean, with South Africa, it was just so profound. You know, people would just say, well, I would say, well, but, you know, I mean, how would you, there are no Black people. Don't you ask yourself, if you're such a minority and you're in such fear, where are the Black people? What? I don't understand. I mean, and it's sort of the same here, you know, how could you not ask what's happening to all those folks down south? Why is it an issue? But as I said, we'll get back to that. Okay, anything else? Quick? All right, let's go back and there'll still be more time at the end. Okay, so this is one of those classic emancipation pictures. On one side showing you know, the conditions of enslavement, you know, the kinds of things that happen to people, and on the right is the future, you know, and in the middle, you know, is that watch night image of the multi-generational family secure in their home, and now figuring out, are we going to go forward or are we going to go back? And during this 2-year period now, there were a lot of things happening. One of the first things in terms of how do we create this new society was the reconnection of family and friends. And as I mentioned, a lot of the energy of the abolitionist movement went into education because people simply had not received any education up to now. In order to function fully in a society, it was important to have that. And so there were professional letter writers who would write letters to the newspaper, and the newspaper had columns specifically like the classified ads, specifically for these letters. And so people wrote letters looking for their family members. And these letters were exchanged throughout the South in all the newspapers, and even in the North, if people thought that someone had gone to the North. And so there's a, you know, and it's interesting, sometimes there's little to no detail. I left them in a trader's yard, their names, Moses George. But the other one, there may be very specific details. But the information very often was directed to the churches. All right. So, and the churches would have a time after the sermon, or, you know, during the service, when they would actually read any letters that they thought might be relevant to their congregation. And so you had literate whites acting as authors for these scribes, for the poorly educated enslaved Africa, formerly enslaved. And now the church as institution serving as a conduit to reconnect individuals, families, friends. All right. And so again, there's some very detailed information. I was sold to someone's brother, brought to Mobile, the father's name, the sisters, we belong, my name, but my owner changed it. Very detailed information. And the same with the other one. Bought by a speculator in Charlotte, North Carolina, carried to Columbus, Alabama, then went to Canton, then New Orleans, belonged to this guy. He kept a cavern. I mean, very detailed information. And this was how people communicated, in addition to people who simply, as they traveled, people talked with one another, people shared information. Whenever anyone went to a new community, there was always an interrogation as to where they had been and what they had known, and that became part of a community dialogue to ensure that the community continued to grow and gain strength by reconnecting. But now specifically with respect to Texas, and I take you back for a moment because it's just, it's just really interesting how the world works. But this land belonged to Mexico. Now, we don't like to talk about that, but it belonged to Mexico. And the original Austin, I think it was Milo, he actually had a contract for land that he got from Mexico for this area. And that became the Texas colony. And his father's contract, because Mexico prohibited slavery, his father's contract prohibited slavery. But when Stephen Austin inherited his father's contract, he renegotiated, because he said, in order for the economy to grow, we have to have enslaved labor. That's the only way we can make this work. And so that it was agreed upon from the beginning that first census in 1825, 4 years after the contract, only 443 out of 1,800. But 5 years later, they renegotiate now and actually establish the state of Texas. And that first one said that there would be no more enslaved humans, and all children born would be free at birth. So this was negotiated with Texas, that even though this contract now, we said, okay, there'd be enslaved people, now there was to be no enslavement and all children born would be free. But unfortunately, it didn't last long, because just within a year, what they did was they went back to the European practice of indentured servitude, and they said that the indentured servitude would be allowed, and then the Africans were brought in under that banner. And so they were supposed to sign these contracts showing that it was an indenture, but all indentures were actually time bound. So they were supposed to be free after they had worked off their debt or served their time for whatever the issue was. But this renegotiation that Austin did said that if they became free, that might be technical, but they really weren't going to be free. And definitely their children would be indentured to the master for life, which is enslavement. There's no difference. Okay. And so again, a year later now, slavery is abolished for Mexico, but Austin held out and said, cannot happen for Texas. And then in 1836, we've got a true independence for Texas from Mexico. They're going to come into the United States government. But the Texas Constitution still specified slavery, not 3/4, 3/5 of a human. It said it would be slavery and all slaves would remain in servitude. So we're time-bound, intergenerational enslavement. And it also said, and this became the sticking point, is that the U.S. Congress was prohibited from, the U.S. Congress could not stop the further importation or introduction of slaves. So the U.S., the federal government accepted the Texas Constitution that said that the U.S. government could not stop Texas from bringing in more people. Okay? And then the final point is that the enslaved were personal property. And so this is the that section 9 of the original Constitution. All persons of color who were slaves or are now held in bondage shall remain in the like state of servitude. And Congress passed no laws, nor shall Congress have the power to emancipate slaves, nor shall any slaveholder be allowed to emancipate his or her slave without the consent of Congress. All right. So, hold on. Sorry. Okay. And there's just a quick graph showing from 1837 to 1845, prior to the Civil War. The blue line, the bottom line, is the number of slaveholders. So the number of slaveholders from 1837 to 1845 remains below 5,000. But the number of enslaved persons goes from just below 5,000 to close to 25,000 in the same time period. So you can see the interest in the use of this labor for the development of this colony was firmly entrenched. So that's my question. Was this liberation or was this treason? When Gordon issues his famous order. Now, the order, as opposed to the General Emancipation Proclamation, you remember, which is that everybody is free and the federal government will enforce it using its military or naval power and will do nothing to restrict those acts. That's what the Emancipation Proclamation that Lincoln signed said. And now 2 years later, here is Granger's General Order number 3 that says, A, all slaves are free. But B, the condition now between them becomes that between employer and hired labor. The freedmen were to stay where they were and work for wages. They were not allowed to congregate at the military post. And finally, they will not be supported in idleness at any time. Now, this is completely contrary to what the federal government had said 2 years before. And it set the stage then for a lot of what happens during Reconstruction, when not only the government, but the paramilitary and informal social forces were used to suppress the interests and the advancements of African Americans. So the Reconstruction, again, Delaware and Kentucky until December 1865. Reconstruction was 63 to 77. And the amendments 13th, 14th, and 15th, again, looking specifically at, yes, the Union victory, Republican form of government in the former Confederacy, tick, but a permanent end to slavery, no, and prevent any return to semi-slavery status, absolutely not. So this is Andrew Johnson, who was vice president at the time of Nixon's assassination. He was a Southerner. He was brought in as a compromise. I think he was generally unprincipled and weak-willed, and it was just extremely unfortunate that he was the person to step into, the shoes of the Confederacy and lead the country through this tumultuous period. The Freedmen's Bureau was perceived, and just think again about some of the things that are happening today. Think about the bill that, well, not the bill, think about the lawsuit that's been filed against USDA because of the appropriations that were being directed to African-American farmers. So that the Freedmen's Bureau, even though the bulk of the resources really went to poor whites, it was perceived as really keeping Black people idle. And that was against the needs of the community and the economy. And so it really, it certainly wasn't the case anywhere you looked where people actually were able to provide for their own resources. When I said earlier that, the inability of the vice president who became president to actually govern the country, and the fact that that Granger's order at the end there, saying that people could not be idle. You had the rise of groups like the White League, what's called the Patty Rollers. You had, poor whites generally, men who really had lost their jobs, did not have land, and were used by landowners to keep control, social control in the community. And so they would very often just ride through the countryside. And if you saw a Black man, a woman, whatever, you pick them up and take them to jail. They wouldn't have funds to secure bail. And they would basically be put to work under forced labor for a local landowner. So that, the ending of the semi-permanent enslavement or servitude, it was very much existed and continued for a substantial amount of time. So this cartoon says actually, the Reconstruction, post-Reconstruction period was actually worse than slavery, because there was a certain amount of understanding of what was to happen, how it was to happen, and when. But now there was simply random hooliganism that didn't allow people to get ahead. So I had to do one or two of these. Why the continuing perception that Black people are lazy, Black people are incompetent, Black people are dirty, all the other isms, and very often this is perpetuated. The early discussion in terms of what did people know and how did they know it and when did they know it, and we have to look at all the different organs of society that were used to communicate certain ideas about people within the different groups within society. So here, the example of soap, with the implication being that if Black people only use a particular kind of soap, they would be as white as white people. The other is that Black people are naturally dirty, but if you use this particular flycatcher paper, then the flies won't linger. They'll ignore the dirt because this is such effective paper. So and there are a lot of similar advertisements that reinforce for people negative perceptions about a particular group. And it wasn't just true for Black people, it was also true for the LGBTQI community. And this is an example, you have to look closely here, because this is an example of two Union soldiers, and they're smoking each other's cigars. So if you look there, you see their arms are, so they're not smoking their own, but each other's cigars. And there are various discussions that there really was not, there was an understanding and perception of certain behavior, but it wasn't discussed or seen as a consistent state of being. And so this was actually the beginning of that change of narrative as well in terms of the existence of gays and lesbians. It was Black as well as white. And although within traditional African communities, there are certain social customs where men and women engage in physical contact that is different from what exists with many Western societies or cultures, there was still the presence of African-American men who were gay at this period of time and were part of the changing of the narrative for this discussion. And it wasn't just for women. Now this one is just the woman challenging the man. If you don't be a soldier, I'll be a soldier. And it really was because there were a significant number of women who actually fought, particularly on the side of the Union, dressed as men, and they lived as men. And then after the war, some of them did not return to their families. Some of them engaged in same-sex relationships. Others were actually brutalized by the social condition, the social institutions, and the healthcare institutions. There's one infamous example of a woman who was a soldier, and she was actually a medic, and dressed as a man, lived as a man, was a medic, was exemplary, got medals for bravery, the whole bit. And then when she became sick in the Army, she ran away because she knew that if she was examined by a doctor, then he would know that she was actually female. And so then she was charged with desertion and lost her medal. She later went, again, a different medical condition, went for treatment, was found to be a woman, and she was actually put into an asylum for the insane. And she was forced to dress as a woman for the rest of her days. So there are a number of stories that are just beginning to come out. And again, not only just white women, but it was also Black women. And this is a lesbian couple as well. And just a quick note on William Dorsey Swann, who is actually recognized as the first drag queen in the US. And what's important is that he was arrested for running a male brothel, and rather than go to jail and take his fine and be quiet about it, he actually protested and he wrote letters up to Congress. Again, because he just did not think that one's orientation should be a reason for being oppressed by society. And so he wasn't successful, but and he continued his brothel in another city. And then of course the suffragettes. I mentioned earlier that the various laws, congressional legislation that said that it applied for people. Anytime the word people, they were talking about white men. Unfortunately, many white women were as dismissive of Black women as white men were dismissive of Black men. And so it was, and again, this is something that Frederick Douglass spoke to quite eloquently in terms of the lack of involvement of quite competent African-American women. I mentioned that I'm doing using the political cartoons, and I just want to make a note for Henry Louis Jackson, who was actually recognized as the first African-American political cartoonist and was most active during this time. And this is his self-image cartoon, but again, looking at what is the future for freedmen, what is the future for the society as a whole. But he was quite active. So Jubilee Day itself, June 19th. My question is, given everything, should we continue a narrative that says the folks didn't know they were free until Granger came? Or do we understand that folks knew they were free, they simply weren't allowed to be free? So on from the first day, there was no celebration. But 1866, so that's the issue. is that in 1866 now, you had people who said June 19th, 1865 was so significant, given what we were up against, that we have to mark it. So for me, I'm like, that 1866 group, I want to know who were they? Because they were the ones who said, this is, you know, the fact that the federal government was actually able to overturn the state of Texas. And there was discussion within Texas that they should actually succeed to Mexico, but Mexico didn't want them. But, you know, but it was for that next year, that group to say, this was so significant, we can never forget this, because we cannot allow this to happen again. In 1872, a group of African Americans actually purchased land that became known as Emancipation Park, because in just that brief period of time, from 1866 to 1871, they were not allowed to celebrate Juneteenth in public spaces. So again, the backlash has already started with a very brief period of time. And I like this one, 1892, this is a little bit later. And really, we got to go back to the churches, because this is a program now, and I thought, whoa, you're really putting a burden on the seniors, as it were. But he says at 5 a.m., the bell should be rung by the oldest member of the church to begin the celebration. 5 a.m., the oldest member of the church. And then midway, it says, ex-slave reunion. Everybody that knows anything about the evils of slavery, meet and have a talk and compare it with the present, i.e. our religion and educational advantages. So there was a deliberate effort within the institutions that we controlled to remember. So sometimes folks say, well, you know, we didn't care, we got lost, people ran, and you know, they didn't know. There were specific ways to ensure that we did not forget, at least until the turn of the century. And then some other stuff starts to happen. Certainly with any celebratory occasion, there's music. We enhanced whatever resources we had. The gardeners among us will appreciate this, because the wheels are completely decorated with flowers. The whole cart is actually decorated with flowers. So again, we use the resources we had to show our celebratory intent. And later, of course, there were large parades, and always food. Sometimes the food was to raise funds, again, for educational purposes and or as part of a political rally. Because more and more now, as people began to seek, or they always sought political power, but as they were beginning to see openings for political power, then Juneteenth was used for voter registration and to raise funds for political activities. And now we come to a national holiday in a more contemporary sense, where at a minimum there are, or as part of it, there are enactments showing the different aspects. But we also need to understand, how do we celebrate, educate, and agitate? So it's interesting that Texas was actually the first to recognize Juneteenth as a holiday. Now, South Dakota is the only state that is holding out, and the cities and companies are recognizing it at an informal level. And so the parades continue. In Ohio, last year we had the statute actually designating it as a day, and then it was proposed by Herschel Craig and Andrew Brenner. And then it was passed, so June 19th in Ohio is a permanent state holiday for all Ohio government employees. And because many companies follow the government employees, many companies now have it as a holiday as well. And then less than 2 weeks ago, it became a national holiday, and this was a State Bill 475. that amended the US Code, simply inserting the 5 words or 4 words in the date, the Juneteenth National Independence Day. But I'm now nearing the end, and I wanted to put this slide here and just take a moment, because it was actually developed for Reconstruction. And it was actually looking at, in order to restore the Union, both how do you keep a balance. Now this was serious consideration, a balance between liberty and order. What are we going through today? How do we strike, what is that balance between liberty and order? What does order look like? What does liberty look like? And within that, is it at the federal or state level? And then who gets the vote? Just yesterday, the Supreme Court knocked down or upheld the Arizona voting restrictions. And we know that when we look at who gets the vote, we then know who gets to hold office. So these were the very issues that Reconstruction was supposed to address that we're actually still looking at today. And yes, there are the amendments on the side, we've got the discussion, but we look down and then we see these key areas. Yes, we've got some serious issues in terms of Native Americans and their relationship in terms of being on federal land and federal obligations and federal rights versus the states. And we look at the, especially around the resources that still exist or that transverse their property. And so the rights and privileges and duties and responsibilities of the Native Americans are still being challenged. Women, and we look at it. So, and one of the slides, a couple of slides I was considering I didn't put in, was just the role of women in upholding the Confederacy. And very often, people think about political power as being a male phenomenon and don't look at the role of women, particularly within the family, in upholding. I think another slide I've got of the Ku Klux Klan, and it was the women officers of the Klan, and then the former Confederates. And that's why I took a few minutes really to look at the role of Texas, and we look at Texas again today. The Confederate War was for 4 years. And look at the emotional and political and historical and educational and any other all you want to come up with hold that it has on the US population. And you would think at this point we would have been able to resolve some of these issues, but we haven't, because we haven't faced them head on. We haven't looked at why didn't people do what they knew they ought to do? Certainly the question of immigrants. And at that time, they were looking more at the immigrants coming from Europe. And now we're looking more at immigrants coming from South America and to some extent, Asia and Africa. But again, determining people's ability to be a citizen or to participate in political power is based on their status within the US, and then certainly African Americans. And I know various commentators were saying that, for the court to uphold the Arizona voting restrictions really was a return to this era. And so we really need to look at what are those things that we can do to ensure that it's not, and how do we change the narrative around this process to ensure that we don't. So this was prepared for Reconstruction, but for me, it's right on for today. So I started with Frederick Douglass, I'll end with Frederick Douglass. It's the same speech, but it's very interesting when he says that we really become, and in 1852, he says the United States has become part of this global community. 1852, all right? Oceans no longer divide, but link nations together. Space is comparatively annihilated. 1852, space is comparatively annihilated. Thoughts expressed on one side of the Atlantic are distinctly heard on the other. We've got someone, I'm sitting in Columbus, Ohio. We have someone on the call from South Africa tonight. The celestial empire, the skies, the mystery of ages is being solved. And now they've started collecting, who is it now? You can pay to go into space. There's commercial commercial travel to space, no more restricted to astronauts, okay? However, he says, no abuse. He says, well, the fiat of the Almighty, let there be light, has not yet spent its force. No abuse, no outrage, whether in taste, sport, or avarice, can now hide itself from the all-pervading light. So regardless of what we see people doing, which is clearly adverse to what we know to be right, it cannot prevail forever. And so I thank you. I'll open up again for questions, comments. We have a few minutes, but I know if people have their wine, they've got family and friends waiting for them, and I know you have to leave, no problem.
Well, I'm glad this was recorded because I'm going to look at it again, and that is when I would take copious notes.
Okay.
I need to say a comment.
Oh, go ahead.
Like, Julialynne, I know we're running out of time, but I've just read something or heard something why the reconstruction period ended or failed was because the Republican Party, which was for many Black people the party of Lincoln, up until the 60s, made a deal with the Democratic Party, which then reversed everything that was being done. And it's interesting to me that today the Democratic Party is viewed as this liberal force, but I came through an era when the word Dixiecrat was a real thing, and the Democratic Party was the party of the Ku Klux Klan, and that whole period after that. So it is interesting to me that many people don't know that nowadays. Right. Particularly young folks. They don't understand that there's been a flip-flop.
Right. Yeah, that's part of what I meant when I said that Andrew Johnson, when he was vice president and then after the assassination became president, that was the beginning of the horse trading that undermined Reconstruction. And so you're absolutely right that because Lincoln freed the slaves, the Republican Party was seen as the party of freedom, of independence, liberation, and people voted Republican without any question, without any doubt. But that definitely changed, and it started with Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And then in the 60s, there was a serious with remember Fannie Lou Hamer and the the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. I do, say it. And so yes, and I clearly remember the battles that went on then, and the Democrats proved themselves to still have some to not be fully in support of African American liberation, and so it's still a continuing struggle. I mean, that's a discussion today around Biden, that Black women basically got Biden into office based on this historical fidelity. And yet, we have not so far received the rewards that people think should be due. Yeah. Any others?
I mean, Hillary Clinton went to a historic Black church and claimed that all lives mattered. I mean, this isn't necessarily a change of tune for Democrats, which is really frustrating.
Yeah.
In all this time that there should be more change.
There really should be, but I think, but part of that is we also have to fight for the change. I think that so part of, you know, for me, changing the narrative is understanding that we've had a consistent, there's been consistent resistance and there's been consistent fight back. And so we need to build on that and clarify that. Sorry, that's me. But yeah, that's it. Anyone else? I know Belinda just came on. She's okay.
Sorry, it's Kai. I just want to say that it was well worth my time. This was very, very informative. So I will sleep well. Thank you for a really good an excellent presentation. Thanks very much. It was really a learning experience for me tonight. So all the best with the rest of the stuff that you do. I know you do a lot of things.
Thank you. I just wanted to have fun tonight.
Thank you, Julialynne. I got in late. Kate sent me the notice. I running around, just saw it. But I know it's been recorded, so I'll get a chance to see it again. But it's always great to see you and hear at least a part of the presentation. But I'll look forward to seeing it in the re-record method if you let everybody do that. Okay. So thank you for letting me in. Appreciate it.
Of course, always. Okay. Charles or I know Mariba Kelsey, I know you got something to say.
So thank you very much for the presentation. I learned a great deal, and it's good to go back and look at the history of where we were and where we are now.
Yeah, I think we're really, it's encyclical. We so much of where we are today is just where we have been, and we need to, you know, where possible, learn from it. Yeah, thank you. Charles, you have anything?
Let's see. Yeah, I enjoyed it very much and learned quite a bit. And now I have to go back and hit the books.
all of us. Okay. Well then, you know, it's just something that I wanted to do, and I thought, given you know, the 4th of July and given the Juneteenth is a holiday, this just might be a good time to do it.
Well, this is Mariba. Yeah, I do have, I want to express appreciation for you presenting what you present, because it further emphasizes the question, should we be celebrating or should we be planning?
Right.
And I think that's because the system essentially has remained in place, and we assume that it moved when it really didn't move, even though the law seemed to imply that it moved. Right. So it's so important for us to recognize this and not be duped into celebrations that are not real.
That's it. And so that's why, you know, yes, we're going to observe, because we need to know our history, but we need to know our history by actually understanding what is our narrative, not the one that's being imposed on us. They didn't know they were free. They knew they were free. All this going on, all this communication, the telegraph was there, the newspaper, people are moving. Now, remember, they moved all those people, you know, like 50, 60,000 people from the South into Texas. And so they brought their stories with them. They knew they were free. It's just that the state of Texas said its constitution did not allow it to accept this federal rule. And we need to, and so we should observe it because it is a marker in our history. But we need to educate ourselves around it and then agitate what do we need to do today to change the conditions that seem to be the same, you know, even though like from that chart, it's reconstruct, you know, from Reconstruction. Okay. So I'm going to send everyone on their way. I hope you have a hot cup of tea or a glass of wine waiting for you someplace. Charles has his books waiting. I'm sure some other folk have some books waiting. And then I'll see you when I see you. All right?
Thank you so much.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Bye now.
Thank you, Dr. Walker.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Dr. Walker.
Take
Thank you,
care.
Julialynne.
Yeah, always. You know, I like to have fun. This is how I spend my Fridays.
Everybody be safe. Have a great weekend. Bye-bye.
Take care. You too. Be safe.